Welcome back to Ancient Dream, where history whispers its most captivating tales as the world settles into peaceful slumber. I am your host, and tonight, as you find your most comfortable position beneath warm covers, we re-embarking on a journey that spans continents and centuries. The lamp beside your bed casts that perfect golden glow, and outside your window, the world has grown quiet, just as it did for countless travelers who once gazed up at these same stars from their camps along the world's most legendary trade route. Tonight, let your imagination carry you across vast deserts where caravans moved like gentle waves across endless sand, through mountain passes where the air grows thin and crisp, and into bustling bazaars where the aroma of exotic spices mingles with the soft murmur of negotiations in a dozen different languages. We're going to meet the merchants of the Silk Road, those remarkable souls who connected east and west long before the world seemed small, long before we could cross oceans in hours or continents in days. Close your eyes if you like, and let the rhythm of our story carry you to sleep, just as the steady footsteps of camels once carried precious cargo across the known world. This is the story of courage, commerce, and connection, told in the gentle cadence perfect for these quiet hours. Picture, if you will, the year 138 BCE. The world map looks nothing like the one you know today. Vast blank spaces stretch across what we now call Central Asia, and somewhere in the court of Emperor W of the Ha dynasty, an ambitious plan is taking shape. A Chinese explorer named Zheng Qian is preparing for a journey that will accidentally create the most important trade network in human history. He doesn't know it yet, but his diplomatic mission to forge alliances against common enemies will instead open doorways to wealth and wonder that will endure for over 1,000 years. Zheng Qian sets out with 100 men, riding westward from the Chinese capital. The landscape gradually transforms from the familiar fields of home to something altogether more mysterious. The Gobi Desert stretches before them, its vastness broken only by the occasional oasis, those precious islands of green where palm trees cluster around springs of sweet water. The desert is not the empty wasteland that many imagine, but rather a sea of shifting sand dunes that sing in the wind, creating haunting melodies that travelers swear sound almost like human voices calling across the void. But Zheng Qian's story, remarkable as it is, represents just the beginning of our tale. The real magic happens in the centuries that follow, when merchants and traders from dozens of different cultures begin to traverse these routes regularly, creating a network so complex and far-reaching that no single person could comprehend its full scope. These weren't just trade routes, they were the arteries of civilization itself, pumping life and culture and knowledge from one end of the known world to the other. The merchants who traveled these roads were not ordinary people. They possessed a kind of courage that's hard to understand in our modern world of GPS and emergency services. They ventured into territories where maps were unreliable at best, where the next source of water might be weeks away, where bandits could appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Yet they went, again and again, driven by the promise of profits so extraordinary that they justified risks that would terrify most of us today. Consider Ahmad al-Farghani, a 9th century merchant from Fergana Valley, whose detailed journals provide us with one of our most intimate looks at life on the Silk Road. Ahmad began his career as the son of a modest carpet weaver, but he possessed what his contemporaries called the seeing eye, the ability to recognize value where others saw only curiosities. His first journey to China was almost his last. Crossing the Taklamakan Desert, his caravan became separated in a sandstorm that lasted 3 days. When the winds finally died down, Ahmad found himself alone except for 2 camels and a handful of other survivors, lost in a landscape that looked identical in every direction. They were saved by a Sogdian trader named Rustam, who spotted their smoke signal from his own camp 5 miles away. Rustam was one of the most successful merchants of his era, and he recognized something in young Ahmad that reminded him of himself decades earlier. The Sogdians were the premier traders of the Silk Road, people from the region that is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, who had developed trade into a high art. They spoke multiple languages, maintained trading posts from Constantinople to Chang, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate the complex web of currencies, customs, and cultural expectations that govern commerce across the known world. Under Rustam's guidance, Ahmad learned the subtle skills that separated successful merchants from those who merely survived. He learned to read the sky for weather patterns that wouldn't manifest for days. He discovered how to evaluate the quality of silk by touch alone, how to determine the purity of spices by scent, how to assess the authenticity of precious stones using techniques passed down through generations. More importantly, he learned the delicate art of negotiation, which required not just business acumen but cultural sensitivity of the highest order. The Silk Road was never a single route, but rather a network of paths that branched and converged like the tributaries of some great river system. The northern route ran through the Tian Shan Mountains, where traders would stop at cities like Kashgar and Samarkand. The southern route skirted the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, passing through oases like Khotan and Yarkand. There were also sea routes that connected Chinese ports to the Indian Ocean, where merchants could sail to Ceylon, India, and eventually to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. Each path had its own character, its own dangers, and its own rewards. The mountain routes offered cooler temperatures and more reliable water sources, but they also meant dealing with treacherous passes where a single misstep could send an entire caravan tumbling into some nameless gorge. The desert routes were harsh and unforgiving, but they were also more direct, and the oases that dotted these paths had developed into sophisticated trading centers where merchants could rest, resupply, and conduct business in relative safety. The city of Kashgar, located at the western edge of China in what is now Xinjiang province, was perhaps the most crucial hub of the entire network. Merchants approaching from the east would have traveled for months across China, navigating bureaucratic checkpoints and paying taxes to local authorities. By the time they reached Kashgar, they were ready to celebrate, and the city was perfectly designed to accommodate their needs. The Great Bazaar of Kashgar was a marvel of organization and diversity. Separate sections were devoted to different types of goods: silk and textiles in one area, precious metals and gems in another, spices and medicines in a third. The merchants who gathered there represented every major trading culture of the medieval world. Chinese silk merchants rubbed shoulders with Arab spice traders. Persian carpet dealers negotiated with Indian ivory carvers. Byzantine gold merchants examined Tibetan turquoise. The air buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages, and the fragrance that hung over everything was an intoxicating blend of sandalwood, cinnamon, rose petals, and 1,000 other scents that had traveled incredible distances to converge in this one place. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Kashgar, and indeed of all the great Silk Road trading centers, was how these diverse groups managed to conduct business together despite profound differences in language, religion, and custom. They developed a sophisticated system of commercial law that transcended cultural boundaries. They created standardized weights and measures that allowed merchants from different regions to trade with confidence. They established networks of credit that made it possible to conduct transactions worth enormous sums without actually moving physical currency across thousands of miles of dangerous territory. The Sogdians were particularly instrumental in developing these systems. Their capital, Samarkand, was not just a city but an institution unto itself. The Sogdians had been trading along these routes for centuries before the term Silk Road was ever coined, and they had developed a merchant culture that was remarkably sophisticated. Young Sogdian boys were sent to trading posts in distant cities to learn languages and customs. Sogdian merchant families maintained detailed records of market conditions, political situations, and travel conditions across the entire network. They created a kind of informal intelligence service that kept merchants informed about everything from bandit activity to harvest failures to political upheavals that might affect trade. The goods that moved along these routes tell their own fascinating stories. Silk, of course, was the most famous and valuable commodity. Chinese silk production was a closely guarded state secret for centuries, and the penalty for revealing the process to foreigners was death. The silk that reached European markets was worth more than its weight in gold, and European nobles would trade entire estates for a few bolts of the finest Chinese silk. The Romans were so obsessed with silk that their historians worried about the drain of gold to China, predicting economic collapse if the trend continued. But silk was just the beginning. From China also came porcelain so fine that European potters spent centuries trying to replicate it, tea that would eventually reshape global commerce, paper that revolutionized learning and record-keeping, and gunpowder that would transform warfare. The magnetic compass, invented by Chinese navigators, made long-distance sea travel far safer and more reliable. Chinese innovations in metallurgy produced steel that was superior to anything available in Europe for many centuries. Traveling westward, merchants carried spices that were literally worth more than precious metals. A single pound of black pepper could purchase a sheep. Cinnamon was so valuable that Arab traders created elaborate myths about its origins to protect their sources and justify their prices. They told stories of giant birds that used cinnamon sticks to build their nests in impossibly tall cliffs, and of brave merchants who had to trick these birds into dropping their precious cargo. Saffron, derived from crocus flowers grown in Kashmir, was worth more than gold by weight, and was considered so precious that it was often used as currency in its own right. From India came diamonds and other precious stones, ivory carved by master artisans, cotton textiles dyed in colors so vivid they seemed to glow, and an array of medicinal herbs and compounds that formed the basis of medical practice across much of the ancient world. Indian mathematicians and astronomers also contributed knowledge that was as valuable as any physical commodity. The numerical system we use today, including the concept of zero, traveled along these same routes, eventually reaching Europe through Arab intermediaries. The Islamic world contributed its own treasures to this flowing river of commerce. Persian carpets, woven with patterns so intricate that a single carpet might take years to complete, were prized from China to Byzantium. Islamic artisans had perfected techniques for working with gold, silver, and precious stones that produced objects of breathtaking beauty. The city of Damascus gave its name to a particular type of steel that was famous throughout the ancient world for its strength and sharpness. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon Greek and Roman knowledge, contributing advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that would eventually help spark the European Renaissance. From the Byzantine Empire and Europe came goods that were exotic in Eastern markets. Umber from the Baltic coast, furs from the Russian forests, silver from German mines, and glassware from Venice all found eager buyers in Chinese and Indian markets. European horses, particularly those bred in Central Asia, were highly prized by Chinese armies. Byzantine gold coins, with their standardized weight and purity, became one of the most trusted forms of currency along the entire network. The merchants who moved these goods were more than mere traders. They were cultural ambassadors, carrying ideas and innovations along with their cargo. A Nestorian Christian merchant from Syria might find himself explaining his religious beliefs to a Buddhist monk in a monastery outside Kashgar. A Muslim trader from Baghdad could encounter Zoroastrian fire worshippers in Samarkand and Confucian scholars in Chang'an. These interactions weren't always smooth, but they created a level of cultural exchange that was unprecedented in human history. The practical challenges of long-distance trade in the ancient world were staggering. A typical journey from Chang'an to Constantinople could take 2 years or more, and that assumed everything went well. Merchants had to plan for seasonal weather patterns, political instability, fluctuating exchange rates, and the simple logistics of keeping large numbers of people and animals fed and healthy across thousands of miles of often hostile terrain. The camel caravans that are so iconic in our imagination of the Silk Road were marvels of organization. A typical caravan might include several hundred camels, dozens of merchants, guards, guides, and support staff. The camels themselves were carefully selected for their ability to carry heavy loads across difficult terrain while requiring relatively little food and water. A good caravan camel could carry up to 400 pounds and travel 20 to 30 miles per day under the right conditions. The caravan leaders, known as caravanbashis, were men of extraordinary skill and experience. They needed to be part navigator, part diplomat, part psychologist, and part general. They had to know not just the physical routes, but also the political landscape, They needed to understand which local authorities could be trusted, which required special payments or gifts, and which were best avoided altogether. They had to manage the complex dynamics within their own caravan, mediating disputes between merchants, maintaining morale during difficult passages, and making life-or-death decisions about routes and timing. The cities that grew up along these routes developed their own unique character, shaped by their role as meeting places between different worlds. Take Bukhara, located in what is now Uzbekistan, which became one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning and culture. The merchants who stopped there found not just a place to rest and trade, but a city filled with libraries, schools, and workshops where some of the finest craftsmen in the world practiced their arts. The rulers of Bukhara understood that knowledge was as valuable as any physical commodity, and they competed with other cities to attract the most talented scholars and artisans. Samarkand, Bukhara's rival and neighbor, took a different approach. Under rulers like Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, Samarkand became a showcase of architectural magnificence. The city's rulers imported the finest craftsmen from across their empire to create buildings that would demonstrate their power and sophistication to visiting merchants and diplomats. The result was a city of breathtaking beauty, where every public building was a work of art designed to inspire awe and respect. These cities also developed sophisticated financial systems that made long-distance trade far more practical. The concept of credit, which seems so fundamental to modern commerce, was largely developed by merchants operating along these routes. A trader in Baghdad could write a letter of credit that would be honored by bankers in Beijing. This system, which Islamic scholars refined into a high art, made it possible to conduct enormous transactions without actually moving gold and silver across dangerous territories. The human stories embedded in this vast commercial network are endlessly fascinating. Consider the tale of Li Qingezhao, one of the few documented female merchants of the Song dynasty period. In a world where women rarely traveled far from home, Li managed to build a trading empire that stretched from southern China to Central Asia. She began by selling silk embroidery created by the women of her household, but she gradually expanded into trading rare books, medicinal herbs, and eventually precious stones. The practical challenges of long-distance trade in the ancient world were staggering. A typical journey from Chang and to Constantinople could take 2 years or more, and that assumed everything went well. Merchants had to plan for seasonal weather patterns, political instability, fluctuating exchange rates, and the simple logistics of keeping large numbers of people and animals fed and healthy across thousands of miles of often hostile terrain. The camel caravans that are so iconic in our imagination of the Silk Road were marvels of organization. A typical caravan might include several hundred camels, dozens of merchants, guards, guides, and support staff. The camels themselves were carefully selected for their ability to carry heavy loads across difficult terrain while requiring relatively little food and water. A good caravan camel could carry up to 400 pounds and travel 20 to 30 miles per day under the right conditions. The caravan leaders, known as caravanbashis, were men of extraordinary skill and experience. They needed to be part navigator, part diplomat, part psychologist, and part general. They had to know not just the physical routes, but also the political landscape. They needed to understand which local authorities could be trusted, which required special payments or gifts, and which were best avoided altogether. They had to manage the complex dynamics within their own caravan, mediating disputes between merchants, maintaining morale during difficult passages, and making life or death decisions about routes and timing. The cities that grew up along these routes developed their own unique character, shaped by their role as meeting places between different worlds. Take Bokhara, located in what is now Uzbekistan, which became one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning and culture. The merchants who stopped there found not just a place to rest and trade, but a city filled with libraries, schools, and workshops where some of the finest craftsmen in the world practiced their arts. The rulers of Bokhara understood that knowledge was as valuable as any physical commodity, and they competed with other cities to attract the most talented scholars and artisans. Samarkand, Bokhara's rival and neighbor, took a different approach. Under rulers like Timur, Known in the West as Tamerlane, Samarkand became a showcase of architectural magnificence. The city's rulers imported the finest craftsmen from across their empire to create buildings that would demonstrate their power and sophistication to visiting merchants and diplomats. The result was a city of breathtaking beauty, where every public building was a work of art designed to inspire awe and respect. These cities also developed sophisticated financial systems that made long-distance trade far more practical. The concept of credit, which seems so fundamental to modern commerce, was largely developed by merchants operating along these routes. A trader in Baghdad could write a letter of credit that would be honored by bankers in Beijing. This system, which Islamic scholars refined into a high art, made it possible to conduct enormous transactions without actually moving gold and silver across dangerous territories. The human stories embedded in this vast commercial network are endlessly fascinating. Consider the tale of Li Qingzhao, one of the few documented female merchants of the Song dynasty period. In a world where women rarely traveled far from home, Li managed to build a trading empire that stretched from southern China to Central Asia. She began by selling silk embroidery created by the women of her household, but she gradually expanded into trading rare books, medicinal herbs, and eventually precious stones. More importantly, perhaps, they demonstrated that human beings from different cultures, speaking different languages and following different religious traditions, could work together successfully when they shared common interests. The Silk Road merchants created a kind of international community based on mutual respect, shared risk, and the understanding that prosperity was most secure when it was shared widely. Their cities, many now buried under desert sand or reduced to archaeological sites, once hummed with conversations in dozens of languages. Their caravans, which once stretched like moving cities across the landscape, carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, artistic techniques, religious beliefs, and scientific knowledge. They created the world's first truly global culture, a cosmopolitan civilization that valued curiosity, adaptability, and entrepreneurial spirit above rigid adherence to traditional boundaries. The merchants of the Silk Road were, in many ways, the first global citizens. They had to be comfortable in multiple cultures, fluent in several languages, and adaptable to rapidly changing circumstances. They developed a pragmatic approach to cultural differences, focusing on what united rather than divided them. They understood that trust was the most valuable currency in long-distance trade, and they built reputations that could span continents and outlive their creators. Their stories remind us that globalization is not a recent phenomenon, but rather a fundamental human impulse that has been driving economic and cultural development for thousands of years. The specific technologies change, but the underlying motivations remain constant. The desire for profit, certainly, but also curiosity about the wider world, the thrill of adventure, and the satisfaction of connecting distant peoples through mutually beneficial exchange. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine those ancient caravans moving slowly across moonlit deserts, their bells chiming softly in the night air. Picture the merchants gathered around campfires, sharing stories of distant cities and exotic customs, planning the next day's journey toward destinations that existed more as dreams than certainties. Feel the weight of silk and spices, the gleam of precious metals, the smooth texture of carved ivory, all carried by people who understood that the world was far larger and more wonderful than their maps could ever show. These merchants built bridges across the ancient world using nothing more than courage, curiosity, and an unshakable belief that prosperity could be created through peaceful exchange. Their legacy lives on not just in the goods they traded or the routes they established, but in the fundamental idea that human beings, despite all their differences, share common hopes and dreams that can form the foundation for mutual understanding and shared success. The Silk Road merchants gave us our first glimpse of what a truly connected world might look like, and in doing so, they helped create the world we inhabit today. Their stories of courage, ingenuity, and cross-cultural cooperation remain as relevant now as they were 1,000 years ago, reminding us that the boundaries between peoples are often less important than the bridges we choose to build across them. And with that thought, let yourself sink deeper into comfort, carrying with you the dreams of those ancient travelers who looked up at these same stars and imagined the wonders that awaited them over the next horizon. Sweet dreams from all of us at Ancient Dream, where the past whispers its most beautiful secrets to help guide you gently towards sleep.